Hi, it's Todd of Todd's Workshop and Todd Cutler here, and today we're going to talk a little bit about longbow arrows, English longbow arrows. Now the first thing I'll say is that the myth and legend that surrounds the English longbow just makes it obscures so much hard information, because there's so many people out there who just absolutely say this is it, this is fact. I'll try not to be one of those people, and that's not what my channel is about. So I will say it the way I believe it to be and explain why I think that, and then we'll take it from there. I have, 6 different arrow forms here, and they're all during various points fairly normal kind of arrows. So we will start with the armour-piercing Bodkin. This is fitted to a warbow shaft, let's say between 30 and 32 inches long. Depending, I think Mary Rose is about 30.5 inches, I think. And traditionally the cloth yard shaft was supposed to be 32 inches, I believe. So anyway, 30.5 to 32 inches for an ash shaft. Iron or steel head upon it, which has 4 faces. Now the 4 faces are quite important, because if you imagine taking a round arrow and trying to shoot that through steel, what then has to happen to the steel is you deform it, you have to break through, you have to deform it and stretch it until it's wide enough to allow the arrow to pass. Now that takes a great deal of energy. It takes less energy if you cut 4 cuts in it, and then those steel panels get bent back in a very characteristic shape. The sort of 4 triangles get bent back, leaving enough room for the arrowhead to pass. But, and here's the but, to try and pass arrows through armour, I have yet to encounter anybody who's really successfully done it through what I would consider to be a decent piece of armour. So if you take something like Agincourt, they were making armour out of iron largely at the time, perhaps there's a bit of steel there. But upon the breastplate, for instance, and the front of the helmet, the thickness can really get quite high, so sort of maybe 3 millimeters or up to 1/8 of an inch, kind of in that direction. And I see people on YouTube or wherever it might be, and they're putting arrows through 1.2 millimeter steel. I've even seen cheats where people have pulled out an aluminium plate and go, look, it shoots through steel. And it's like, wrong colour. So again, you look at the historical treaties and you talk about French knights, for instance, fearing that the arrows will go through the breadths of their helmet, not through their breastplates, but through the vents of the helmet. Well, that of course might be a bit of or a lot of a weak spot. So yes, you would consider that. But towards the end of the 100 Years' War, what the French were doing to effectively defeat the English archers was heads down, walk slowly, punch up maybe, but basically make sure all the gaps were covered, and they were pretty impenetrable. So the whole thing about English arrows shooting through armour, yeah, sure, it happened occasionally if the armour was bad or it was a weak spot or it was a lucky shot, but essentially it didn't really happen. That's my understanding of it. Now the other thing that's very interesting about these arrowheads is, of course, wrought iron is the cheap material to make them from, but wrought iron doesn't keep a good cutting edge here, and you do need a good cutting edge. And again, most modern reproduction is just done out of mild steel, which is a bit harder than wrought iron, but not a great deal. You could fashion them completely out of steel, but that becomes an expensive process. So what you see in records is you see arrowheads where it says arrowheads at X price, or if they are steeled, they are a higher price. Now, we don't really know the definition of the word steeled, what they mean by that. My guess, because it would be appropriate to the arrowhead, and they certainly could do it, is that it's case hardening. So you can take 500 arrowheads, pack them in a box full of charcoal, clay pot, bake that in a fire for 8 hours, 10 hours, and a very thin film of carbon impregnates itself into the surface of the iron, or the fairly low-grade steel, and you end up with an absolutely super hard steel jacket around the arrowhead. Now, metallurgical analysis hasn't shown that in any arrowheads that I know of, but there is the argument that the layer is so very thin of high carbon steel on the outside that actually it would just be rusted away in all cases. So I think it's never been proved definitively, but if you ask my opinion, these things only ever stand a chance of working if they are made from a super, super hard steel, or in that case hardened, a super hard steel jacket on fundamentally a wrought iron core. So that would be my take on the armour piercing arrow. This is a needle bodkin. Now, as plate armour came in, so this is very much a 14th century, a 13th, 14th century item. Now, as plate armour came in, this long needle upon the end, it's just going to bend. So that's going to be no good at all for plate armour, which is why it got shorter and stubbier for the plate cutting arrowheads. Now, this long one is to defeat mail, so actually it is less important. It doesn't cut so much as poke its way through the rings. But essentially, that's just got one ring that it needs to defeat before it can pass deeper. Yes, it's got the padded jack beneath it and so on, but this makes it an easier arrowhead to make. The technology of it, the steel that's required is fundamentally a lower grade, and wrought iron would basically do it. So there's no need to steel these ones or to case harden them. But this, of course, fell out of use as mail fell out of use. So by the time you get to about 1400, these things are not, you're not facing mail on a battlefield anymore, or not so much, not against knights anyway. And so these sort of arrowheads have fallen out of use. Then we get the last of the military heads I have here, which this is quite an aggressively barbed one, but nonetheless it's true for sort of type 16s, the classic ones where the barb sort of comes in. I suppose you'd call this an open type 16, I guess. You've got two cutting faces here. Now that, of course, will not defeat armour. It will not go through mail, and it will not go through plate. It's just the wrong shape. But it is, of course, very, very good at going into flesh. That's the whole point of it. You've got these barbs here. Now, as you can tell from my dress up here, I'm on a reenactment at the moment. And one of the questions that often comes is, well, how do you get that arrowhead out? And people go, oh, do you push it through? And it's like, well, that's what, it's an inch wide, 25mm wide, that cutting edge. If it's in your leg, let's say it's not that deeply in, but if it's in your leg, if you've got to push that through, yeah, it's going to hurt, it's going to do all those things. But the other thing, you've now absolutely committed yourself to perhaps a devastating arterial injury that you simply didn't have before. And you're making a much bigger wound. You know, so basically you're not going to do that. Can you cut it out? Well, yes, you can cut it out because you can't really pull it, but you could put a slit there and sort of like probe into the slit. But yet again, you're just increasing the wound size that you've got. And if there's one thing about medieval people we know, they didn't necessarily have the technology we had, but they had the same brains we've got. They feel the same pain, and they weren't stupid. So they find a way. And one of the ways, which I think is just beautifully simple, is that the arrow goes in, and as you can see now, it's catching on my flesh. I can't pull the arrow out without it ripping my hand apart. Now, if it goes in, well, you need to find a way out to get it out. So you can take a pair of feathers, it's just a goose quill, and if you poke within the wound, you can just poke it on, going deep into the wound, and you see there, it now lodges on the end of the barb, and the barb now can come clean off my hand without any danger of it hurting me. Now, what I will say about this feather technique is, and it's one of the dangers actually, in truth, of not being an academic and not following my sources up, is I've known this fact for 20 years, that this is how people would remove an arrowhead. Where I came across that, I actually simply cannot remember. I have no idea how I know this or why I know this. And as a consequence, I can't actually tell you that it's true. However, when people are getting shot continuously with arrows, as happens in warfare, you find ways, you find solutions to problems. And I would put quite a lot of money on it that this would be one of the methods for withdrawing an arrow, particularly if you can't find a barber surgeon who's got all the specialist tools and so forth, because of course they existed. But if you can't afford them, you can't find one, well, you make do, don't you? And some clever guy in your band is going to work out that that's all you need to do, and you can pull your arrow out. The next we'll talk about is a very simple leaf shape. Now, this sort of form was certainly used by the Saxons, presumably the Vikings also, and to be honest, probably went back way before that. And it just carries on and carries on through the medieval period. And it's just a simple leaf-shaped arrowhead. It's wide, it's got a cutting surface, so it's going to be good for sort of good levels of penetration, but also it's going to be good against moderate-sized game, so something like boar, perhaps. Certainly in Saxon Viking times, and I'm guessing in medieval, I don't know, but it would also be a sort of a warhead as well. So both hunting and war I would put that type down as. Now, this is an interesting one. So I know it's a swallowtail head, and it is a very broad cutting head. Swallowtail because it's like the shape of a swallow's tail, and it is typically a hunting head. Now, this is fitted to a hunting shaft. Now, what I will say actually about all of these arrows is that they are in the most disgusting condition possible. They're just part of a reenactment kit that's just been left in a garage for 20 years or something, and it is embarrassing, but it's also there. Now, the thing about hunting, and we're going to come to Gaston Phoebus, we're going to talk about him in a minute. He was an author around about just before the year 1400 who wrote some fantastic books, illustrated all about medieval hunting. Extraordinary things if you can find them. And what you see there again and again is that men are not shooting deer from 100 metres away or 50 metres away. They're doing it from really close. They're stalking. They're getting right in there. And the reason for that is, and I can tell you because I've done it, is at 25 metres, 25 yards. If you're watching the man who's shooting the bow, you can step aside from the arrow. I did it with blunts, by the way. I'm not that brave or stupid. But you can step aside from the arrow. And if I can step aside from the arrow at 25 yards, sure as hell a deer is going to hear it and start and run. And you'll miss. So you've got to get very close. Now, the other reason that you get very close is that these big veins on the front, they steer the arrow itself. So the long shaft length allows some stability, and it's good stability because of the long shaft, but still you've got these big veins on the front, and that wants to steer it in other directions. And so it is never going to be a very accurate arrow. Now, what is particularly the case, and I discovered this myself, is I wanted to put them onto crossbow bolts. Big swallowtails like this. And you see it throughout things like manuscripts like Gaston Phoebus. You see these big arrowheads on these crossbows. I shot that at 5-6 metres yards, and I shot the swallowtail straight at the centre, just testing it out. And no kidding aside, it went down and it rose again and it swept in. And so this whole bolt, this crossbow bolt, over such a short distance went like that. Utterly unusable and very annoying because that's what I wanted to fit. Now, I can only come to the conclusion that the illustrations that you see in works like Gaston Phoebus, what they're doing, it's a very medieval thing, but they're highlighting the fact that these crossbows had hunting heads on them. And so they're drawn bigger than they would otherwise be. That's my premise on it, because I've tried it and I just cannot see it. I had to cut mine right down to about 28 millimetres, inch and a bit, something like that in width, before it would start behaving itself. This has large cutting faces that would be sort of sharpened up, razor sharp really. And so when that goes in the chest of a beast, a deer or something, what you're really trying to do is to make the thing bleed out as fast as possible. So like an armour-piercing head, although that's stuck through the heart of a deer or something, it's not going to do it any favours. It's still going to run. And in dense woodland, it can run far enough that you can't find it. And it's not leaving a massive blood trail because the arrow shaft is plugging the hole that it's made. One like this, you're cutting 50 mil, 2 inches wide, or maybe more, with a small hole plugging it. So you get a good blood trail that you can follow. But the other thing that's interesting about these is that when they go in, if you imagine that this is the chest of the beast and this is the muscles on the side, as they move, as the thing runs, it stirs the arrow shaft around. And so if it is sharpened up, razor sharp, it does move around. And you can kind of see that it can actually walk itself deeper. So the actual action of the beast running causes more damage. So this will allow the beast to drop as swift as possible. And then the last of the arrows we're going to come to is a mystery, or at least I believe it to be a mystery. Now, talking of Gaston Phoebus again, you see this crescent-shaped head again on hunting crossbows. You see that quite a lot. Why it's this shape, I have no idea. I can't imagine. But they're not necessarily, as people say, for hunting birds, because they're not shown in that context. They're shown in the context of beasts, of boar and deer and such things. I haven't seen a manuscript with this on a longbow, so I don't know for certain that they are longbow arrows. Maybe somebody out there does. But you do see them on crossbows. I've heard so many different versions of it. I've heard that they're for birding. I've heard, for goodness sake, that they're for cutting rigging on ships. I've heard many different things. But there are two things about them that I know. One, you see them in Gaston Phoebus in hunting scenes where they're hunting beasts, not birds. The other thing I know about them is if you do shoot them onto the ground, if you're roving in a field or something like that, and your arrow, if it hits the grass, will just otherwise bury itself, these do stop, catch and fall over. They act like, in the modern archery sense, a judo point. They keep the arrow on the surface, and that is also correct. Saying that, a wooden blunt upon the end, and I think they were probably used a lot actually, a wooden blunt upon the end does exactly the same thing. It doesn't bury itself in the ground. So there we have it, really. We have 6 different arrowheads, longbow heads. 6 different varieties, all fitted to very poor condition arrows. I'm sorry about that. And that is my take on what they are, what they're for, and how they did it. Thank you very much.